Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're happy to be here with Dr. Maha Aziz to talk today about, I think, a really interesting global perspective topic that we're going to connect to the question of entrepreneurs, founders, tech startups. But Dr. Maha Aziz is here with us. She's a professor in global risk and prediction at NYU in their international relations program. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to everyone in the audience for coming. For those of you who are new, Betaworks Studios, we are a virtual membership club and a physical membership club in New York, but we're here to support people who are building in the tech entrepreneur startup space. And virtually, we host daily events, and we have lots of resources for entrepreneurs and a community to help people grow their businesses and learn how to build better tech products for the world. And I think that's why, we're really excited to have Dr. Aziz here to talk about sort of what she works on, predicting and understanding what's happening in the world globally in terms of economics, politics. How can we understand what's changing internationally with governments and legitimacy of those governments and the influence of people who are around the world protesting, standing up, making their voices heard? How is that impacting how traditional governments and states are running our country, other countries? So Dr. Aziz, just from reading your bio, I see you were born in Jordan. You're of Pakistani origin, and you've lived all over the world. So I'm imagining that influenced your interest in having this sort of global perspective of like, how can we predict what's going to happen on the international stage? So I'm excited to hear more about your first book, Future World Order, which came out last year, and then its sequel, The COVID-19 Effect, just coming out this year in November, correct?
Exactly.
And I'm sure you'll talk about why you felt the need to update sort of in light of the pandemic and everything that has happened, what's going on in terms of democracy and global actors worldwide. You also are an author and a comic book, a cartoonist, right?
Yeah.
So your political comic book is called The Global Kid. And I hope you talk about that, and definitely we can touch on it in the Q&A too if people are interested. But I'm curious to hear about the VR, AR political comic book that you're launching as a spinoff from that as well. So I'll let you get started with your presentation, and then we'll have Q&A at the end, so folks can put their questions during the talk into the Q&A section. It's right at the bottom of the speaker screen in Zoom. Put your questions in there for Dr. Aziz, and we'll bring them up at the end.
Okay, thank you, Annalisa. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it a lot. So hello, everyone. It's really great to connect with the Betaworks community. I do live in New York, and I've been to the club and attended some events. So it's a pleasure to be sharing ideas with you. As Annalisa mentioned, I'm a social scientist. My job is basically making sense of the world so that others can make better decisions. And I've been doing this since 2012, looking at this idea of global risk. What are the threats to our stability today? How could these risks evolve in the future? So there's definitely a future focus element to what I do. And as she mentioned, my home base is NYU, where I teach and work with graduate students in international relations to help understand what are the risks, what are the threats to our stability, and what could go wrong. But I also have spent in the last few months, in particular, I've had to transition and adapt as well. More opportunity for online education, online teaching. I was teaching a course to a global group of high school students, also a group of diplomats from around the world working for different governments. So definitely, even in my field, I've had to adapt, and I imagine given COVID-19, you and as entrepreneurs have also had to reimagine your focus, your mission. Related to that, I also have consulted on this topic for many years with governments and corporates, but I think it's important to share ideas with the masses, and that's why that's what led to this book, Future World Order, which I'll shamelessly plug now. I was actually in Egypt when for a book talk for Future World Order in March, early March, thinking I would have a relaxing holiday after my book talk at this conference. And then of course the pandemic struck and managed to get to London. And then I realized, although the book I've written, which reflects what we'll be dealing with in the 2020s, particularly in terms of the effect of technology on our stability, I realized that it's not complete. If my mandate is to make sense of the world and help others make decisions, I need to reflect on the pandemic and how that is going to reshape the 2020s, to be honest. And that's what's led to this book. And it should launch, as Annalisa mentioned, late November into December. And certainly do reach out if you have any follow-up questions about the book or anything I say today. Related to that, last but not least, before I talk about my view of the world and the effect of the pandemic, I am indeed an amateur cartoonist. I always dreamt of being a cartoonist when I was a kid, and I grew up all over the world, and I guess drawing was a coping mechanism, you know, changing schools so often. And I revisited that passion 20 years later, crowdfunded $10,000 on Indiegogo, and launched this entrepreneurial effort, which I guess this audience of entrepreneurs should appreciate. And launched it in 2016. It went on to win 5 awards, including 2 last year. This is, I'll just quickly show it to you, yeah, the Global Kid. And it's for the tween audience. And like I said, it teaches kids about the world today. And really back then, it identified a lot of the global risks that exist today, that continue today. And the next phase of this project emerged during the pandemic. In fact, there's definitely a need for more of us, including youth, to be aware of how the world is evolving, given there's so much uncertainty and we don't always have guidance or the truth from our world leaders. So I'm working with some techies to develop a virtual reality, augmented reality version of my comic book to enlighten tweens and even older audience about all of these changes that we're seeing and where we could be headed, and especially what role can we play. So keep you posted about that. If this all keeps on track, it'll launch in spring next year. So I guess I have a bit of an entrepreneurial spirit. But anyway, now let's talk about the world today and where we have been in the last decade, to be honest, and where we're headed in the 2020s, partly because of COVID-19. What I argue in my work, in my research, in my book, is that what we've witnessed in the last decade, if you look at everything that's happened since the Arab Spring, we've seen that the same types of incidents keep happening where citizens are challenging their political systems. There's a lack of clarity about certain key ideas like who's in charge and about what our shared values are. And it's really been building in the 2010s. And it's what I describe as a global legitimacy crisis. So I want to walk you through these 4 areas of this global legitimacy crisis that reflect global risks, threats to our stability, and then tie it to the pandemic effect. And certainly, ultimately, I hope to challenge you to see if any of your startups or apps or whatever it is that you're doing can be tailored to tackle some of these problems that are deeply entrenched in our global fabric. First of all, the first aspect of our global legitimacy crisis, which is a global risk, is the fact that in the last decade in particular, we've seen that we have not been clear about what the structure of the world order is. Who's in charge? If it's not a US-led international system, who's in charge? And I think what's been interesting to observe is that even before the current president of the US took office, there were still challenges, significant challenges to the geopolitical status quo, where that post-Cold War era, where it was assumed that the US was in charge and that the US government was setting the global agenda, the global tone. What we witnessed in the 2010s is that many countries and many actors have challenged that. Of course, the question is, what is the structure of the world order? Is it, if it's not US led, what is it? And in my book, I go into different scenarios. Is the international world order simply defined by a US versus China competition? That's certainly plausible. Is it simply defined by this idea of the future being Asian, as this scholar Parag Khanna argues in his work? Is this world simply defined by, has it been defined by a post-American world where we've seen other superpowers rise as the US has lost its edge in certain aspects of its power? But what I have tried to argue in my work is that perhaps what we've witnessed is the decline of US hegemony, and that perhaps this period of uncertainty where we're not clear who will ultimately be the major stakeholder or power player, is that this is a post-hegemonic system where it's clear that the US has taken a different position. And I'm not convinced that if there is a change in leadership with the election in November here in the US, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything will snap back into place, that we will suddenly be living in a post-Cold War era where the US has the legitimacy to set the tone. So I think we will certainly have to wait and see. But I think what's also been interesting to observe is that we've seen the rise of non-state actors that are shaping or pushing back against the current world order. In the 2010s, we've seen that there have been other types of influencers, non-state actors that at times seem to be mobilizing and having a significant influence. For instance, citizen protesters launching mass movements against climate change or against policies policies against what President Trump has said. We've also seen the rise of activist billionaires who, again, perhaps in response to a perceived lack of global leadership, have felt that they need to step up and raise awareness about certain issues, or at times fill the policy gap. And in fact, there are examples of activist tech billionaires in particular, a newer wave of activist tech billionaires that seem to be wanting to have more influence on a geopolitical stage. And related to that, perhaps tech firms are also the new influencers that are reshaping the very nature of power and the structure of our world order. Then, of course, COVID-19 happened. And I think, if anything, the pandemic has reminded us that COVID-19 has reminded us that there is a lack of global leadership. It's been quite frustrating to see that despite meetings with the G20, the G7, and other major players, we haven't really had a unified response to our pandemic, reminding us that we really don't know who's in charge. It's obviously been very positive to see that certain countries have committed billions of dollars for this vaccine, but at the same time, a new trend or pattern has emerged, what I have termed a form of COVID-19 bilateralism, which has perhaps tried to fill the leadership void, where you have different countries like China, for instance, that has certainly taken a global lead in this, but other countries like Turkey, South Korea, India, Cuba, they have stepped up their efforts to offer medical support under this umbrella of COVID-19 diplomacy to other countries. And I think what will be interesting to observe in this coming decade, as we continue to try to understand who's in charge, what is the structure of our world order, it'll be interesting to see how these new or renewed alliances rooted in COVID-19 diplomacy or COVID-19 bilateralism, how these perhaps reshape the world order. And I think the fact that we're not clear adds to our global risks. It adds to the instability that we will likely have to deal with. Related to that, it's also been very interesting to observe that many tech billionaires, non-state actors like tech billionaires, and I'm talking about people like Jack Ma, Adrian Chang, and of course everyone knows about the work that Bill Gates is doing with regards to the vaccine and so forth. But to see these non-state actors, these tech billionaires, directly linking with governments around the world to offer medical support. Again, another example of COVID-19 bilateralism, and showing us that perhaps the very nature of power in the coming decade is going to continue to evolve, where it's not so state-centric. I think the game changer potentially to reshape our world order in the coming decade is probably going to be if one country creates the vaccine and shares it with everybody else, then perhaps that country, maybe China, will have the legitimacy or have more influence around the world. So could COVID-19 diplomacy or vaccine nationalism reshape our world order? The other contender is, of course, Russia, that claims to already have a vaccine ready. It's going to be interesting to observe how this aspect of the current pandemic is going to shape the current decade in terms of geopolitics. Related to that, I think it's important to reflect on the political aspect of our global legitimacy crisis that really came to being in the 2010s, where we saw many governments around the world experience a challenge to their governments, we saw a challenge to the political status quo, which really led to larger debates about whether democracy is still the best system. If you think even beyond the Arab Spring region, we've seen citizen-led movements in places like Brazil, South Korea, across Europe, challenging the governments in terms of policy, and even at times bringing down leaders, suggesting that citizens are angry with the current political systems in place. And what I feel will be important for us to reflect on is whether there may be a need for a new type of social contract that reflects the current tech-driven, pandemic-driven world order. I also think, again, that it may be worth reflecting on these new types of political influencers that have come up in the last decade, and that will continue to shape the 2020s in terms of, again, in terms of the citizen protester challenging governments, in terms of the tech billionaire often trying to fill the gap left by governments and even the tech firm. Again, COVID-19 has had a significant effect on this political, the political aspect of our global legitimacy crisis, where what we've seen already is that citizens are seeing that their governments are falling short in their COVID-19 response. And I think we're going to see a resurgence in anti-government protests where citizens are wondering, wait a minute, did our governments do enough? Are they preparing us enough? Did they introduce lockdown soon enough? Did so many people have to die? And I think we will see a resurgence in this crisis of political legitimacy that will renew the dialogue about whether our current political systems in our individual countries are the best option. And is democracy still the best system, as was dictated by a US-led world order post-Cold War? Is that still the case? Or do we need to make changes? Again, I would say it's time to think about a renewed social contract that perhaps allows for more opportunity or dialogue between citizen and government, because we can't deny the citizen protests around the world that have recurred in the last decade and will continue into the 2020s, perhaps representing a global spring, not an Arab Spring or a European Spring, but a global spring. In my book, my new book, I try to reflect on a COVID-19 social contract. What would that mean? What would that look like? And perhaps this could be an opportunity for us to think about whether there's a need for, well, it's controversial, but do we need a more defined role for these activists millionaires and billionaires who recurrently seem to fill that policy gap. And there are examples in Hong Kong, here in the US, Nigeria, and other countries as well. And just empirically, if you reflect on the pandemic, we've seen that certain female leaders, for instance, Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, have managed to manage the pandemic a lot better than their male counterparts. Is the pandemic a reminder that we need more women in government, in leadership roles? Just something to think about. Related to that, I want you to be aware of the fact that economically, we've seen that, of course, there has been in the last decade a significant challenge to globalization, coming from economic nationalism and populism. And I imagine that will continue in the coming years, certainly for the coming months and years and perhaps decade. I think if you reflect on the last decade, we've been recurrently reminded, particularly by activist tech billionaires, that many of us are going to lose our jobs. To quote Jack Ma, 40% in the next 15 years, 40% of jobs will be wiped away in the next 15 years, which will create more pain than happiness amongst populations around the world. And I think we will have to deal with that, the concern about automation, unemployment. And this bleeds into a larger discussion that we will have more precariats. These are people who've lost their job due to automation. Perhaps they've lost their jobs previously due to the global youth unemployment crisis, and of course now the pandemic. And these are individuals who, according to Guy Standing, this economist, have developed an occupational identity crisis, meaning they've been left behind by all of these big trends, and they jump from one temporary job to another that is bleeding into our mental health crisis, but relating to occupation. And again, the pandemic has made, sadly, everything worse, because a lot of these relief packages that governments have offered are not necessarily helping everyone at this stage. We even hear finance ministers, for instance, in the UK, saying that, yes, we recognize that a lot of the packages and the policies we're introducing to stimulate the economy, they're not going to help everybody. They won't help every unemployed person. They won't help every small business. There will be many who sadly will have to fall through the cracks. And I imagine there will be more economic frustration that will lead to more protest movements. And as I said, it bleeds into this larger global spring that I think we are kind of in the middle of, or are heading towards in this new environment with the pandemic. In my book, I try to, it's obviously a very difficult challenge, the economic crisis that's brewing and the domestic issues every country is dealing with in terms of economic relief with the pandemic. But is there a need to reimagine the moral economy or the social contract, the economic contract that we have with our governments? I think that will be a discussion that will come up significantly in the coming decade. And I think there's so many studies that suggest if there are more women in the workforce, our economies will increase significantly. And so it seems like an obvious point, but why haven't we made these changes? For so many years, we've been talking about the future is female. Why can't the future be now in terms of these sorts of elements? But I think what we need to watch for in the coming year and decade is this growing economic class of precariats, people who are faced with an occupational identity crisis because they're falling through the cracks of our global economy. They're falling through the cracks in terms of stimulus packages, economic relief packages relating to the pandemic. Who will take care of this growing class globally, particularly when governments seem to be falling short? So that will be an important question that will, I think, define the coming years. And lastly, and this is an aspect of our global legitimacy crisis. This is a global risk that I feel we fail to really discuss sufficiently. And it's this idea that, you know, pre-pandemic, it seemed pretty clear that we were dealing with this identity question. Are we globalists or are we nationalists? Do we care about the other? Because at times it felt like there was this resurgence, the emergence or resurgence of xenophobia, of hate, of racism, that pretty much was in every part of the world, every region of the world. And as we've seen in many parts of the world, for instance, here in the US, but also in Latin America and Europe, we saw tech-savvy hate groups leveraging their energies against migrants and refugees. We pre-pandemic saw that a lot of groups, religious minorities in particular, for instance, in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, even in India, were being targeted by certain extremist groups. And again, it led to this larger, it's led to this larger question recurrently about what our values are. The pandemic has definitely deepened a lot of these existing social strains, but it's also created new ones. And I think you're probably aware that there have been in the last few months a lot of misinformation campaigns that led to attacks, for instance, on Muslims in India and Rohingya refugees in Malaysia that were related to the pandemic. We've also seen a backlash against certain East Asians globally because of the perceived origin of the virus. And certainly a lot more xenophobic rhetoric from certain political parties, for instance, in Europe, France, Germany, Spain. I still struggle with this idea that if we have this crisis of identity or this lack of shared global values, why has there not been some sort of public counter narrative to such hate? We always hear rhetoric from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres about how hate speech needs to be stopped, and certain world leaders, for instance, Jacinda Ardern, again, I have to highlight her again. She launched a global anti-racism fight last year after the Christchurch attacks there, but there hasn't been much state-led efforts, I feel, to really talk about these sensitive identity issues. And of course, beyond the xenophobia, we've also seen the proliferation or evolution of extremism. If you think about the last decade, from Islamist extremism to Buddhist extremism to Hindu extremism to far-right extremism around the world. Why, again, why is there no counter-narrative to such hate? Well, then the pandemic happened and it exacerbated some of these strains. But then the George Floyd incident happened here in the US. And I think what this could be perhaps the silver lining of the current situation of the pandemic and of our larger global legitimacy crisis. Maybe we don't have state-led dialogue on identity and what our shared global values are, but we clearly have a global community led by citizens who are against hate. They're united in their fight against racism. I think the fact that an event here in the US triggered protests in over 60 countries is remarkable. But again, it was led by citizens. And if only we could somehow retain this energy and develop it such that it was a shared global campaign, a shared global value for a COVID-19 world. Otherwise, in a few months, there's potential for this to regress and for us to go back to what the world was like pre-pandemic. But I think it'll be interesting to see how these different elements of our global legitimacy crisis that existed in the 2010s and will likely deepen in the 2020s, how they will unfold. Will we have clarity about who's in charge of the world in the coming decade? Are we going to have clarity on what the best system politically is? Is democracy still the best system? Thirdly, Will we have clarity on who we are in relation to our work, given this growing group of precariats that are emerging and will continue to emerge as automation unemployment takes shape? And lastly, are we going to really deal with this identity question? Are we globalists or nationalists? Do we have shared global values? And what I want you to think about as entrepreneurs, and obviously I don't know what your different businesses are, but is there potential to leverage or to tailor some of your ventures to tackle some of these risks? For instance, is there a way to leverage technology to connect citizen protesters around the world so they are a more effective movement against certain governments or certain global issues, whether it's climate change or some other issue? Secondly, can we leverage technology? And there is admittedly a significant and growing gov tech sector, but can you in your ventures leverage technology to somehow make governance more efficient, to allow for more citizen government feedback, so that there's less need for citizens to protest and show their frustration in that way? And as I mentioned, precariats, this growing class of unemployed people who are also dealing with a mental health crisis because of this occupational identity issue. Is there a way to leverage your technologies, your ventures to match these precariats with new jobs in the tech sector or in the post-pandemic economy, given that it's unlikely government will provide sufficient support? And lastly, well, you know, how can we leverage technology to create and sustain shared global values in a world in which we don't have a global consensus, we don't have global leadership? It's a difficult situation, to be sure. And I would challenge you to reflect on how you can leverage your ideas, your entrepreneurial ventures to tackle some of these risks that make up our decade-long global legitimacy crisis, and I fear will dominate the 2020s. Like I said, I don't know if a change in leadership here in the US will necessarily mean that all of these problems go away. I feel that there will still be a lot of work to be done. There will still be a need for this average person, the citizen, the entrepreneur to play a role. I don't think this is the time to simply be looking to government to solve our problems. So that's what I wanted to say about that. Yeah, I guess we have about 10 minutes. I just wondered if anybody had any questions. I'm sorry if I raced through all of this, but I think if you just remember these key questions: who's in charge of the world? What's the best political system? Can globalization withstand populism and precariats that are emerging? And are we globalists or nationalists? Do we care about the other? These are the four elements of our global legitimacy crisis that we don't have clarity on and that we'll be dealing with this coming decade. So that's what I wanted to say about that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aziz. I have a million questions and we have questions from the audience. So let's just get right into it, because you've covered lots of areas I think that we could talk about for a long time. Sure. One thing, and I noticed that there was a sort of topical question in the chat, I think when you were referring to the possibility of a vaccine influencing whether or not different countries would become more or less hegemonic in the sort of global order, right? And you'd said like whichever country is able to come up with a vaccine and share it with others, hopefully, that could change the balance of forces. I think that Arpit in the chat mentioned India, ? I don't know if that was saying like, is this a chance for countries like India to actually rise to, the occasion?
Sure. Well, certainly, I think any country that comes up with a vaccine and offers to share it or sell it at a fair price to the rest of the world, I think that country will have the legitimacy and the influence to do a lot more on a global stage. And India certainly shouldn't be discounted at all. And they have engaged in COVID-19 diplomacy I believe they had shared certain perceived, I mean, I don't know if these are effective, but medicines for COVID-19 that President Trump had asked for previously. And they have also taken a leadership role within South Asia to, you know, to feel as though there's at least a regional response to the pandemic. So definitely, I mean, India is certainly a contender, but I guess the point is at this stage, it seems as though China and Russia have been the most vocal about having a vaccine, and Russia, well, Russia's Putin claims it's ready to roll. He says that his daughter has taken it, so that's supposed to make us feel better, but obviously there are concerns about the effectiveness and the validity of these vaccines, and that will be the biggest challenge. But even before these have been officially shared, both China and Russia have offered it to other countries. Again, this is giving them political capital on a global stage, and how these sorts of alliances, these bilateral alliances driven by COVID-19, how these are going to reshape the geopolitical space in the coming decade, or at least for the coming year, it's unclear, and that heightens the stability, the threats to our stability, the risk that we can face. And as I said, I don't know who will win the election. Right now, the prediction markets certainly give Biden the edge, and it's understandable given what we've seen in the last few days with what's happening with President Trump, but it's still a few weeks away. You never know. And the truth is, the pandemic effect on voting is impossible to predict, frankly. Secondly, the perceived interference from China, Iran, Russia in influencing the election, we don't know. It's just one of those unknowns. So it's very difficult to make a judgment on that. But like I said, even if there is a change in leadership, this doesn't mean all of our other problems go away. We have a lot of work to do.
Right. Well, I want to ask a couple questions that are sort of more related to your role as a professor, like your insight into what how young people are thinking about these questions. So one question was, how are Gen Z, younger individuals thinking about all of this? Do they think are they doing things differently that we should learn from? We being older, people who, I'm assuming people who are like later in the stage of being a founder, an entrepreneur, wondering what is the freshest set of eyes take on this?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I guess Generation Z would be like high schoolers, right? Generation Z, that age group. So I primarily work with I primarily work with grad students who are in their 20s, some are in their 30s. But I do, as I mentioned, I do work with high schoolers. In fact, I've been doing it for a few years, but more recently there's been more demand for these online courses given the pandemic. And I have to say, they are a lot more calm than the rest of us. I think because they've grown up in this environment in which there's no, we don't know who's in charge. And I think they are a lot more calm. What I think is concerning, and this is reflected in a lot of significant notable studies, and I want to plug Yasha Monk's book, who did a massive study on, it may have been more to do with millennials, but younger people, according to these sorts of surveys, don't seem to care as much about having democracy. It seems as though they're more concerned about perhaps finding a job or saving the environment. Not that those are, those are important concerns to be sure, but it seems as though they are not as fussed about whether there is a high level of democracy. And I think that is an interesting observation to make, that perhaps in the coming decade, as these Generation Z start to enter the real world and perhaps become entrepreneurs, maybe they will see that voting and the political systems in place don't matter. They're more focused on their startups and how their startups can fill certain gaps in services left behind by government. So that's encouraging, right? That the younger generations seem calm. And obviously it's at this stage, those of us who are older, we are so anxious because it's hard to see the silver lining of what's happening. The other point I will raise is that in some of my talks in the last few months, and of course many were virtual, but I did do a few, for instance, in Salzburg, I went in July when the pandemic momentarily had eased, and I talked about the citizen-led movement largely by youth, to do with being anti-racist in response to George Floyd. And I tried to convey to this audience of older people, meaning late 40s, 50s, 60s, that this is remarkable, that there's this citizen-led movement led in many countries by youth saying we don't want to be racist. And I thought that was such a positive point. And as I said earlier, a silver lining, but most of the audience dismissed it. And I think that's part of the issue, that there's a generation gap. The older generation is not taking some of the actions of these younger citizens seriously. And they're still stuck in these, in this institutional mindset, or this mindset that reflects older ideas of what power and influence are. And I think that is very interesting to observe. How is this going to unfold? I'm not sure, but I think that generational, the gap in generational thinking is clear. And it could certainly shape how things unfold and who ultimately are the power players in the coming decade.
Do you think it's like a fear of that tech that some people see as very positive and enabling democracy, and that, like, a question here is, you know, if far right populists are just as tech savvy as you said, you know, how much faith can we put in these platforms that maybe younger generations see as the key, right?
Yeah.
Amplifying their voices and fighting racism and sexism and all of that. But
Yeah.
if far right, the populist, like, as you said, are we nationalists or
globalists? Yeah.
Globalists. If that trend is also using the same tech platforms,
yeah, exactly, and
amplify their voices.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question and a good point. Definitely, I think that there will be a need to. I mean, we've already discussed over the years. There's been a tech clash. You know, many companies are facing, including Facebook, of course, are facing challenges about the role they play, and they should be challenged. But I think what we're headed towards in the coming decade is perhaps some sort of tech social contract, or a social contract within our countries that takes into account the role that tech companies and their products are playing on our lives. Until that happens, we're going to have this constant push and pull between citizens, governments, and these tech firms. And so that would definitely be something that we should focus on. Do we need a social contract for tech companies in terms of the influence they have? What do we expect of them, and what should we, and vice versa, right? Of course, there's ongoing debate about that data for income swaps, so that should we get paid for the data that we give all these companies? I mean, maybe that will be a relevant question to consider, especially as so many more people are going to be unemployed. Already we were headed for automation unemployment long term, but more near term, we have the pandemic effect on unemployment. So maybe that will be part of the decision. I think at the very least, and I'm not necessarily, I'm not necessarily, you know, I think there's value to what these tech firms do, but I think that it's positive that so many of these tech leaders are talking about possible solutions. Put Facebook aside, which seems to be the most hated one, but other tech leaders have talked about solutions for instance, automation-related unemployment. They keep talking about UBI, Universal Basic Income, how that could be a possible solution for the people who will lose their jobs to robots. Obviously, that dialogue has come up again now, more near term because of the pandemic. And even some of these techies, for instance, Richard Branson, and there's this Sam Altman of Y Combinator, who have talked a lot about this. And Sam Altman has even launched a pilot project to test the viability of UBI as a possibility for people in the future to benefit from. And Richard Branson has also talked about taxing tech firms. If they are going to be the companies that are the most profitable in the future, maybe we should introduce a tax on those companies and that includes him too, to help deal with everything that we're going to be dealing with. So I think the fact that, yes, there's a techlash, we should be suspicious and cautious, but the fact that so many of these tech leaders are vocal about the problems and are at times offering solutions, I think that's positive. Longer term, let's think about a tech social contract so that we are clear as citizens what our relationship with our tech firms are, what we should expect, just as we should have social contract with our governments and renewed social contracts given the pandemic and given the way the world order is evolving.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question, sort of similar vein, like billionaires will slip in to help us, right? Sometimes they get government contracts. How do you think we need to handle this issue of the rise of plutocracy, getting money out of politics? I think, some of this, what you were just talking about is how these big companies can give back. But if that's not the tendency that we see, how do we fight that?
No, I mean, that's a good question. And the truth is, I don't know. I think we've been having this dialogue about the role of some of these wealthy individuals we've been having this dialogue for a while, and I imagine we will continue to have that dialogue in the coming decade. I think what we need to try to see what role these activist tech billionaires are playing when they have tried to fill the policy gap. Is that okay? What is the longer term effect on our political systems? If you have a non-state actor, they're wealthy because of their tech firms, but they're acting as individuals. So what does that mean for our larger political development? Is that okay? I don't know if we at this stage in such a desperate situation, are we really in a position to turn away from somebody who's offering a vaccine or saying that I'm going to reroute my company to make ventilators? I believe Elon Musk did that, so that X country can better handle, or that state can better handle the current pandemic, given our government is struggling. I mean, I understand that longer term there are concerns, and especially in relation to how it impacts democracy, but we are already having this larger debate about whether democracy is the best system. And the younger generation, as I said, they don't care as much about the nature of the political system. So where are we headed? That is what we as individual citizens in our individual countries and as a global community, we need to have these dialogues.
Yeah.
What is the best system in a tech-driven world order and in a pandemic-driven world order? The solution or the dialogue has to start with us, because I think most governments are suffering from a legitimacy crisis. They were pre-pandemic and they are now, because they're falling short of citizen expectation. So, I mean, I wish I had more concrete answers. I think that the first step is to have the dialogue. The second step for you as entrepreneurs is to see if your businesses or your talents, your technologies can be leveraged to tackle any of these issues. Can your technology, like I said earlier, can it help the precariat, the person who has an occupational identity crisis that jumps from one temporary job to the next and is falling behind by globalization, falling behind because of the pandemic? Can your business fill that gap? So anyway.
I think that's great. And I'd love to keep talking. I know our time is up, and I wanted to just end on sort of a lighter note and ask you, do you have any book or podcast recommendations? And maybe I'll say, if you could recommend one book or podcast related to what we've been talking about today, and then maybe one just fun, random.
Sure. Well, in terms of a book, it came out a few years ago, but it's by Moses Naim, and it's called The End of Power. And it relates to some of what we've discussed, that the very nature of power is evolving. It's not just about government. It's not just about the state. It's about the protester. It's about the tech firm. It's about the entrepreneur. So I think that's important to realize, that we all have a role to play in this evolving world order. So definitely check out his book, End of Power.
End of Power, okay.
And in terms of a fun, this is silly. I've been hooked on Netflix's Cobra Kai. So if you want something brainless, but if you saw the original Karate Kid, I would recommend seeing this series, which has some of the original actors, and I've actually been enjoying it a lot. And of course, please watch the French Open. The tennis, I mean, it's so nice to read. The last few months, we've had so many tennis tournaments, so it's been nice to de-stress watching tennis.
That's great. Thank you. Well,
Sure.
thank you everyone for joining. And so, thank you so much, Dr. Aziz, for your insights. And I think just like challenging us in new ways, that's, you know, it's certainly got me thinking.
Great. And please, if anyone would like to reach out or talk about, you know, share ideas, just email me, add me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way.
Okay.
And yeah, thanks so much.
I shared your Twitter in the chat, so.
Got it. Okay, great. Sounds good.
Thank you everyone for joining, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.